Erik Horne here with Maddie Lee after the Thunder's 116-107 loss to the Miami Heat. Maddie, no Russell Westbrook, no Nerlens Noel, who's a late scratch. That puts a team behind the eight ball typically when they're missing two rotation players, but that's not really a good excuse for what we saw tonight from the Thunder. They really didn't put in a very good defensive effort for most of the game. You see that they finally get a little boost of energy in the last 3 minutes or so when they get down by 19 points. So it's really inexcusable for them to go the entire game, know they're not going to have Russell Westbrook, and then all of a sudden come out and essentially, just let the Heat just roll into layups and three-pointers after the first, basically 5 minutes of the game.
Yeah, well, even less excusable is the fact that they did that after getting out to a 13-0 lead. They started the game with a 13-point advantage, completely give it up. As soon as the Heat's second unit comes in, you actually have Dwayne Wade scoring their first points of the night, and that's like practically halfway through. It's like 4 minutes into the first quarter that they finally get points on the board. And then suddenly they just keep chipping away at that lead, and next thing you know, the Heat have a lead.
Yeah, it's not that big of a deal for a team to give up like a 13-point lead necessarily, but it's that it was a combination of things. It was the Thunder stopping what they were doing against that zone defense that the Heat threw at them. Even in the first few minutes when the Heat came out with the zone, the Thunder was able to pass around and move the ball. They did a great job of moving the ball within those first 5 minutes, but they got away from that, got into some isolation, some dribble-heavy possessions. They passed a little too deep once they got into the zone. They didn't finish strongly enough at the rim, and then you combine that with a ton of turnovers. Paul George and Dennis Schroeder combining for 10 turnovers themselves. There's a lot of over-dribbling by Paul George into double defenders, and the Heat did defend very well, and they have one of the top 10 defenses in the league. That snowballs when your defense is having communication issues. There's no rim protection. At the point of pick and roll, they're letting guys roll free because they're having communication issues when they're supposed to switch and when they're not supposed to switch. I asked Steven Adams about that in postgame. The Thunder gives up 60 points in the paint. You just can't give up that many points in the paint when you're playing without a Russell Westbrook, when you're turning the ball over too much. It was really a problem on both ends for the Thunder, probably one of the worst performances we've seen from them collectively all season.
Right, and they first show that they can compete with them and then show that they're not going to. The Heat did a good job double-teaming Paul George, and he said post-game that he's trying to pass out of it, but that doesn't end up being so successful in the first half, and that leads to some of that huge comeback by the Heat. Paul George, finishes the night with over 30 points, but it wasn't the type of coming back and making up for the loss of Westbrook performance that the Thunder needed from him.
No, you just got a lot of wasted possessions out of Paul George too, which is part of the problem. He shot efficiently, but a lot of it was desperation. A lot of it was when the Thunder got down by too many points. And frankly, they just didn't get enough consistent defensive stops all night. The Heat does a great job of not really having a clear delineation between starters and reserves. So when their reserves come in, you're not really getting a chance to have a relax, or you're not really getting a chance to impose your will on them. And then when you push Dennis Schroeder into the starting lineup, that takes away from your reserve unit and the minutes that he can play against lesser players. But if you're bringing a guy like Goran Dragic off the bench, Dwayne Wade, you still got to be mentally focused and locked in enough to play, sound defense against those guys. Those are guys that are former All-Stars. So the Thunder didn't do a good enough job of playing well against those second unit guys. They were undisciplined in their defensive sets. Schroeder was going underneath screens on Dragic, which allowed Dragic to hit 6 3-pointers on the night. Just a lot of bad execution on the Thunder's part on both ends, and it's troubling considering that this team hasn't been playing well since the All-Star break. They're 5-8 since the All-Star break, and they got to go on the road later on this week, or they got to play Toronto in their next 2 games. And Toronto's a really good team out in the Eastern Conference. This is a trouble week for the Thunder. This is a trouble time for the Thunder, even though Billy Donovan says that they're still confident.
Yeah, that second unit that you mentioned also, because of the absences that you have, looked very different throughout the game.
Yeah.
You had a bunch of different guys who we haven't seen in a while get early playing time. You had Hamidou Diallo coming in that first half. You had early minutes from Deontay Burton, and then in the second half you had Billy Donovan Moore going with Patrick Patterson to get a little height in there, because when you don't have Nerlens Noel and you have Steven Adams racking up 5 fouls, suddenly Markieff Morris is your tallest center, or Patrick Patterson if you decide to slide him over to the 5. So they get horribly outscored by the Heat's second unit, and we saw a lot of guys.
Look, and it also comes down to, again, we've said this time and time again, since the Thunder kind of cooled off from their offensive streak, guys have got to make more shots. You know, Terrence Ferguson's got to shoot better than 3 from 9 from 3, which is actually pretty good, but one of those came late in the game where the game was out of hand. You know, Dennis Schroeder goes 2 of 5. Paul George ends up going 4 of 11, and, you know, a bunch of those attempts were late. He would have shot a better percentage if not for having to shoot a bunch of those attempts late when the Thunder was basically scrambling for offensive rebounds.
He also missed 3 in one possession.
Yeah,
so.
the bench combined goes 0 of 10 from 3 because Schroeder's pushed into the starting lineup, so he doesn't count as a bench player. The bench misses 10 3-pointers on their own. You know, the Heat's bench outscored them 67-10. So you're not getting contributions from your second unit, who's really struggling, right? Or they at least struggled in this game. The second unit's actually been a bright spot since the break. But more than anything, when you don't have a guy like Russell Westbrook that's able to put as much pressure on the defense as he does, you've got to be careful with the ball. You've got to be careful getting out in transition. They turned the ball over 19 times. They didn't turn the Heat over enough. And now they find themselves in a really precarious situation going into the stretch because they're really bunched up to where they're tight with Utah. They're tight with their game out of the 8th seed now. So it's a difficult situation for the Thunder going into this stretch run of the season when they haven't been playing good basketball and the schedule is not letting up on them.
Yeah, it seems like the end of the season is just coming up real fast. Thunder has a couple more. Next 2 games are against Toronto here and then on the road, and then they head to Memphis after that.
Here's some post-game video from Paul George. Anybody else?
That's
that might
it.
just be Paul George.